Here today to share with us this conference is the great lady of classroom teachers. For under her direction, as its first executive secretary, the Department of Classroom Teachers grew into a dynamic organization. And because of the devotion, the leadership, and the service that she gave to this department, our National Education Association selected her as its executive secretary in charge of the Division of Professional Development and Welfare. And because of her dedication and zeal in striving to make a place for classroom teachers, our department, through you, created a Hilda Mailing Fellowship Fund to aid classroom teachers in their efforts toward improvement. I present to you now the great lady of the Department of Classroom Teachers and of the National Education Association, Miss Hilda Mailing, retired but as busy as ever at her home in Indiana. Yesterday, Lina Sauter of Mississippi presented to you our Southeast region, so I shall not repeat that presentation, but I'm sure you'd like to see the folk who came from North Carolina, that state that boasts of its tobacco, its furniture, and its textile industries. And so I should ask my fellow North Carolinians who presented me this beautiful orchid, won't you stand and boast a little? Perhaps it wouldn't be bragging if I added also that North Carolina will have the president-elect this year, Miss Lois Edinger. Reminisce with me for a bit as I urge you to step back into your own memories. Do you remember your high school and the teacher or the principal who also coached the football and the basketball teams? Remember how folk used to predict each year that he'd have a winning team again this year? Well, then think hard of the time when you found that your principal was leaving and taking another position. Remember when you found that you were also going to have a new superintendent and you wondered how the new guy would be? Well, you probably wondered where he went when he left your school to take still another position. Or maybe you followed his career, and perhaps you knew that he had been asked to take the position of director of the State Department of Education in charge of certification. Or perhaps you left the state before that you learned he had moved on to become assistant to the president of the state university, and then to become executive secretary of the State Education Association. You were no doubt pleasantly surprised then when you found him again occupying a position in the National Education Association as assistant executive secretary, directing the many departments associated with the Division of Professional Development and Welfare. But there were many interesting events between the time you saw him last and that, for there was a period during which he served as executive secretary of the National Education Association's TEPS Commission. And during this time, we saw a rebirth of the view of teacher education as a real, outstanding, vigorous program for teachers. Well, perhaps you never knew who really was behind all of this, but there were many people whose shackles rose when his name was mentioned, because they could be sure that he was speaking for the profession. But did you know that during this time he had become a father of 2 sons, and the proud granddaddy of 4 little children? And would you ever suspect that they could twist him around their fingers as if he were putty? Well, it may be difficult to believe that this man who shakes the critics up with his eloquence and his deeds is the same man who melts when his own grandchildren call. You might have known such a person, just as many people in Arkansas and the rest of the world do. We of the teaching profession, and especially of the Department of Classroom Teachers, are proud that we know this teacher, principal, coach, superintendent, executive secretary, assistant to the university president, and granddaddy, our own champion, whose name is synonymous with professional autonomy, Dr. T.M. Stennett. And will you, his better half, and his backbone, Mrs. Stennett, also stand with him? Dr. Tim Stennett.
Libby, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I think that's quite the loveliest introduction I've ever had, and I would like to reiterate my conviction that your chairman this morning is going to be an embellishment to this organization. I'm pleased, too, that the eloquent citation of Miss Mailing, you know, I succeeded Miss Mailing in her position and sat in her chair. In about a month, I'd been on the job with all of its tremendous headaches, and I called her for advice about something, and she told me that she had that day before fallen down the stairs and broken a toe. And she said, this morning, I'm wearing oversized shoes. And I said, for heaven's sakes, Hilda, stop it. The ones you left down here, I'm sloshing around in already. I sat back in the audience last week and heard the superb presentations. And by the way, may I add, I've had some experience with conferences, and I have not had the privilege of attending one in which the presentations have been so uniformly superb. And the thing that impressed me more than speeches, however, was the outgiving of the audience, the response of the audience. All around me, people would say, I think it must have been a tremendous inspiration to the speakers up here if they were hearing it like I was. This has never happened to me before. I think it may happen to me this morning in reverse. It may be, I appreciated this responsiveness, but, you know, when I start writing in this field, the words just flow. And I find myself with an exegesis instead of an outline when I get through. But I'm going to try to hop, skipping around, and cover this in the time this morning. I have a squeamish feeling, however. I'm going to be like this speech is going to be like the inebriate who wandered onto the mall in Washington one night and came upon that magnificent structure, the Washington Monument, which is always illuminated. And he looked at this thing, and he looked it up and down, and then he muttered to himself, well, that's a beautiful contraption, but I bet you they ain't never going to get it off the ground. And I'm afraid this may be true. Now, my good wife, a severest critic, as wives ought to be, I guess, she always has a very pet formula for making a speech, and she always enunciates this to me every time she's with me. She says, make it short, make it funny, and make it inspirational. Now, I submit to you, this is a perfect formula. The only trouble with it, like you remember Mark Twain when the submarines began to come in the early part of this century, and there's quite a bit of excitement about it, he said nothing to it. Just boil the waters of the ocean and then force the submarines to the top and shoot them like sitting ducks. And somebody said, but how do you boil the waters of the ocean? He said, that isn't my problem. My problem is to tell you what to do, not how to do it. Very simple. She tells me that, now, don't try to tell all you know. She says you put everything to a speech except the kitchen sink. And I guess this is right, but, well, it isn't easy. Referring to our grandchildren, by the way, we had them for a whole week at Christmas time while our son and his wife went to the Sugar Bowl game, and that old saying is they came to visit us on Sunday. The little angels came on Sunday, and the next Sunday the little devils went home. I had anticipated there's going to be difficulty, so I went out, because you see all these football games on January the 1st, and rented a second TV set with the idea I was going to put it back in the bedroom where they could back there and look at their programs. Oh, it had to be put right side of our big set in the living room, and when the New Year's Day bowl games came on, one of them had Captain January on, the other the Three Stooges. And do you think I could get them away from that? No. Well, this reminds me how hard this is to make this kind of a speech of the little 6-year-old boy who started school and got it thrust into your mathematics right away. And in about a month he came home to his mother and said to her, didn't you tell me that the stork brought me? And she said yes. And didn't you tell me that I weighed 8.5 pounds? And she said yes. He said, well, I've got news for you. I made a calculation, and I find the stork doesn't have the wing spread to deliver that kind of a payload. And I doubt if I have the wing spread to deliver this speech this morning. Well, let me say one other word, the preliminary word. I have never, too, as I've said, I've had much experience with the conference, ever seen a college go all out like they have here to entertain you. Of course, it deeply pains me to have to say anything kind about Earl Johnson, but he and Leslie Moth and Dr. Emmons and others have certainly done a wonderful job. The drive for professional autonomy. In this troubled and complex world of relationships in which we find ourselves, perhaps the paramount need is the restoration of the significance of the one. Someone has called it the majority of the one. As urbanization tends more and more to inundate the individual, as modern mass media increasingly manage the news and manipulate human beings into organization men, there must somewhere, somehow, come a massive revolt of the individual if man is to be saved from the debilitating effect of the society he has created. Colin Wilson, in a thin little book that you can read in an hour called The Stature of Man, has phrased the dilemma as follows, quote, "It is hardly surprising that the culture of the mid-20th century is a monument to the unheroic premise. There is an automatic assumption that belief in oneself is a form of self-delusion. This is a major heresy of the 20th century, the very foundation of the unheroic premise, the central cause of the cultural slump of our time." This came home forced me yesterday. I was in Boston for a lecture at Boston College, and I knew I had a tight schedule to get the jet out of there at 5 o'clock, and I was down in the lobby of the Statler Hotel wondering if I should take my bags out to Boston College and go from there to the airport, or if I should leave them there. I ran into a Catholic priest whom I did not know, and I was so discourteous I did not introduce myself. And I said to him, "Father, are you familiar with the Boston College area?" And he said, "Yes, quite well." And then I said, "Tell me, should I take my bags out there to catch this plane?" And he gave me an answer. And then as I turned to walk away, he said, "God bless you." Well, this left me feeling warm inside. Here was a recognition of me as an entity, as a distinct individual in this city of 1 million or more people, crawling around like ants, everybody hurrying, nobody have time to speak to anybody else, nobody knows anybody else, nobody cares. And I don't care what faith it is. That leaves a human being feeling this warmness of identification and recognition. It's good. Likewise, the supreme need of the members of the teaching profession is the restoration of the significance of the one. Indeed, the deepest hunger of teachers, I think, as I talk to them across this country, is to achieve a sense of self-confidence, self-respect, and self-determination. and this I term the premise of significance. The time has come to seek in earnest the realization of this premise, to delineate the how of its realization. When one contemplates the meaning of profession, one must resort to the words of Humpty Dumpty. When I use a word, it means precisely what I choose it to mean, no more, no less. But because of all of the confused words in the English language, the word profession is it. It has become so corrupted or so popularized that every group with any kind of a skill now, as soon as it emerges, calls itself a profession. Originally, as you know, there were three learned professions: medicine, law, and theology. They were called the learned professions because they were the only ones in society and the only ones requiring university education. Fact is, they were the only ones that society in its simple format needed at this time. Presently, there are 23 major professions in American life, all having national professional accrediting processes, and if you consult the United States Census Bureau, you'll find that there are 50 or more organizations or groups classified as professional, technical, kindred occupations. And within a given profession, like medicine or teaching, there are many sub-professions. Thus, there is no the definition of a profession. I find Carr Saunders, the Englishman who's written most in this field, refuses to offer a definition. I shall use the legal definition. A profession is a self-elected, self-disciplined group of individuals who hold themselves out to the public as professing a special skill, primarily in the interest of others. Now let's trace just a little bit the history of the evolution of the teaching profession. I'll do this very quickly. Originally, in fact, until the Reformation, teaching as such, as a separate entity, did not exist. It was a part of the clergy, and preparation for it was a preparation for the clergy. And as such, admission to it was based upon a university education. And it's interesting to note that the university scholars in those days and even today, although they provided the basic preparation for other professions, still yet themselves have not achieved distinct recognition as a profession. This is partly a commentary on the values of our society and partly a commentary on their own attachment to the original emergence of college teaching, I guess at the University of Paris, with a PhD degree. It was degree. I may have this wrong. Yes, that's right. It was and later extended to the master's degree. Simply the degree was the license to teach, and that still adheres in higher education. Second, even after the emergence of teaching, separate from the function of the ministry, the predominance of employment by the state, public employment, tended to lower the status of teaching in the minds of those who adhered to the original concept of a profession. And this has retarded the development of profession in our public schools. The above differences in concepts about teaching have contributed significantly to the continuation of an unfortunate dichotomy. That is, a typical college teacher will not refer to himself as a teacher. He refers to himself as a philosopher, a sociologist, a mathematician, or what have you. And too many of them resent any kinship, whatever, with the profession at the lower levels. And it goes back, you see, to the different stems from which we evoluted. Third, the tradition of university preparation in the European sense has persisted as the only sure and respectable route into a profession. Whenever and wherever the route into professions, willingly or unwillingly, was sought outside the universities, which teaching was forced to do in this country, and which medicine and law were forced to do in England and later into this country, their status remains low. Now, within this century, medicine and law both have fought their way back into the mainstream of higher education and become attached to universities, where they can draw upon the scholars in the feeding disciplines, I call it. As long as each of these was outside the universities, diploma mills were extant, and standards were abysmally low, and never did he have the status, either one of them, that they both now have. Now, teaching had to do the same thing. Of course, this began with the stubbornness of the English universities, Oxford and Cambridge. They offered law, but they offered it in Latin. Their cases were the cases examples of canon law and others taken from antiquity. They would not deal with English common law. Same was true of medicine, and so they forced, therefore, the establishment of the Inns of Court and the Royal College of Surgeons outside the university level. They drove these incipient professions out of the mainstream of the universities, but they now, with teaching, are finding their way back into the mainstream. I glory in the courage and the loyalty of this institution retaining its name of Ball State Teachers College. It's totally against the drift in this country, and I think for a very good reason. And that is, of course, this is not a teacher's college in the sense we're talking about. It's a university. And you have all the attributes that I'm describing here on the campus of this institution as you would have at any major university. Somebody has said, well, we had 300 normal schools at the beginning of the century, and we now have fewer than 40, near 30 single-purpose teachers' colleges remaining in this country. Somebody said the normal schools began to disappear when they began to get abnormal people. Although we still have lots of half-brights getting Fulbrights, we are coming up. And, you know, colleges, when they begin to become coeducational institutions, begin grading on the curve. My wife isn't going to like that one. Well, what are the characteristics of professional autonomy? Well, perhaps the distinguishing mark of any recognized profession is that it is self-managing. It is self-managing. It sets standards of selection, preparation, and licensure to assure competence of those admitted to membership and practice, and sees to it that these are enforced. It defines ethical conduct and standards of professional practice and sees to it that these are enforced. It sets standards for fair treatment of its members and sees to it that these are enforced. It sets standards to assure proper working conditions for its members and sees to it that these are enforced. Finally, it sets standards for adequate remuneration of the services of its members and seeks persistently and vigorously to attain and maintain these standards. Now, so that you may keep in perspective existing machinery of your associations at the national level for setting and enforcing these standards, I want to sketch these for you quickly. At the NEA, the National Education Association, you find the counterpart in the state associations. These activities center pretty largely in the area of professional development and welfare. Would include the National Commission on Teacher Education Professional Standards. It deals with the standards of competence, getting the competent person on the job and seeing that he grows in service. The Committee on Professional Ethics deals with the standards of ethical conduct and ethical practice. The National Commission on Professional Rights and Responsibilities deals with the standards of fair treatment and protection of its members, as well as the investigation of the unethical practice of its members. The Department of Classroom Teachers and the PR&R Commission deal with standards for establishing and enforcing proper working conditions. And the NEA Representative Assembly and the Salary Consultant Service deal with standards of remuneration and their implementation. And I would add to this the Urban Project also, which is not in the professional development and welfare area. Also, it should be pointed out that while specific assignment of specialized responsibilities are thus made, the Department of Classroom Teachers, being the overall representative of the teachers, seeks to disseminate and implement the policies and procedures of these expert groups. It is therefore concerned directly with all of these areas, and the department itself has had a great hand in the creation of most of these expert groups. Now, in connection with the discussion of the characteristics of professional autonomy, I should point out a third characteristic of the profession. You remember the first I mentioned was the university education. The second is self-management. The third I now want to mention is legal recognition. In American society, all the other 23 professions in American life legally are recognized as having the right to run their own business. This is in the law. Look at the boards of licensure, even to cosmetology and barbers, and I do not depreciate these fine occupations. They have their own boards made up of beauticians and barbers. And what I'm saying is that it is essential in the scheme of things in a free society that the law grant a virtual monopoly to a profession to run its own business. Now, this monopoly is what Carl Saunders calls closure, C-L-O-S-U-R-E. The granting to a group of the legal right to perform certain services. For example, a doctor is the only one who can sign a death certificate. A lawyer, although there are some exceptions to this, the only one who can represent a client before the bar. These are assigned by law. It's a monopoly. And then this is enforced by what he called registry, which in our terminology in this country would be licensure. That is, the government itself maintain and keep up to date an authorized list of expert practitioners in each of these professions to which the law has assigned a monopoly. Klaus has expressed the thesis of the necessity of legal recognition of a profession as follows. No profession can exist without this protection under the law. It alone must have the right to set conditions of entrance. It alone must have the right to set codes of professional conduct. It alone must have the right to determine the values of professional competency. It follows from this that it alone must exercise discipline over its members and with due regard to basic human rights remove delinquents from the list. Doctors are stricken from the rolls, lawyers disbarred, priests defrocked. End of quote. Well, the public generally takes a jaundiced view of this. The public generally says you're trying, therefore, for the teachers to have legal control of education in this country. No, that isn't what I'm talking about at all. I put it this way, there are two hemispheres here. One is the hemisphere of education, which is the public's business. It's their schools, they maintain them, they establish policy, they support them. The other hemisphere is the hemisphere of the profession, and that's our business. Or to put it another way, you have two houses here, the house of education and the house of the profession. And we simply call upon a free society, and this could only exist in a free society, for the right to run the house of the profession. You see, this is a unique thing to a free society. It couldn't exist anywhere else in the world, just as accreditation is a unique thing. Because elsewhere, in other societies, the Central Ministry of Education dictate all of these things. But in our free society, we found that it's more productive to our society to assign these functions to the members of a given profession rather than to a governmental bureaucracy. And we found that it has paid great dividends. Well, of course, with respect to these rights, it must be said that they must be operated in the interest of the public. Any monopoly granted by law, by the people, can be taken back from the profession if that profession exploits the right to form a monopoly against the public interest. And, of course, the proposals of Medicare, which may or may not be passed, ultimately will, in my judgment, is really a revolt of the people against certain monopolistic aspects, rightly or wrongly, in their concept. They have this of the medical profession. And the same thing would happen, therefore, to the teaching profession. I say the public takes a jaundiced eye about this. Well, the public looks at this pretty much like the drunk who's going down the street and met a couple of boys, identical twins, and he was staggering along, and the twins just parted and went around him, and he stopped dead still, and he said, "Now, just how did he do that?" The public wants to know how we would do that, how this... These legal rights of teachers and other professionals is the most effective middle course, now get this, is the most effective middle course between the threat of human regimentation by government bureaucracies on the one hand and the rampant, laissez-faire concept of individual freedom of a century ago. In either of these two extremes, the individual is maltreated On the one hand, by the stifling power of bureaucracy. On the other hand, by the ruthless power of the unchecked, rugged entrepreneur. In fact, perhaps the most serious handicap to the freedom of teachers is the tendency of the state to treat them as civil servants and not as professionals. And there is a vast difference, believe me. This attitude is being ameliorated somewhat, but greater impetus must be given to it by the concerted effort of teachers themselves. And moreover, and I want to underscore this, our society needs to encourage the professional mind to be brought to bear upon the affairs of its particular profession, not only, but upon decisions affecting society in general. If you'll just stop and think a minute. In the complex nuclear world in which we live, the life and death decisions of society today are political decisions. And we'd better be about the business of bringing to bear upon those decisions the professional mind, which admittedly ought to be the best prepared, the most altruistic, the most unselfish, and the most objective mind in our society. Now, what are the keys to professional autonomy? Well, number one is machinery for policy making. This is the single greatest weakness of this vast profession of ours in this country. How do you make policy for a profession that reflects the will of the profession? This must be machinery that provides the opportunity for every single member, 2,200,000 of them in this country, to have a voice in fixing policy. Now, I'm not so naive, and neither are you, as to believe that all 2,200,000 will participate in this, but I say they must have the opportunity. Just as we'll never have 100% of our registered voters voting in this country, but they have the opportunity. Sometimes it's been a moot question around the NEA, and I'm sure in the State Association for years, about the NEA Representative Assembly. 7,000 delegates. A lot of people call it a mob. But you know what you run up against when you try to find another formula? You run up against the fact that there is a danger of shutting off the participation of people. Call it a mob if you like, and it is probably too large for efficiency's sake. But I challenge you to find the alternative. If we're to have a self-managing profession, maybe there is an alternative, but I say it's a dangerous one if we don't develop it very carefully. I'll take the process of the TEPS movement as an illustration. I'm glad Dick Kennan isn't here this morning. Well, I don't mean it that way. But I mean, I'm glad he's not hearing what I'm saying, because he always accused me of being partial to TEPS. It's like my wonderful mother-in-law once irked with me about our two boys, and she said, "You love Bobby more than you do Tommy." And I said, Miss Daisy, I always call her Miss Daisy, I said, that's the most absurd statement I ever heard an intelligent woman make. But Dick has always accused me of being partial to the TEPS movement. I just know the TEPS movement better than I do anything. When TEPS was created, and given the responsibility of carrying on a program of stimulation of the improvement of standards in this country, it didn't have any concept that it had supreme powers. It knew that it was the instrument of the people of the teachers of this country, and so it set about immediately to ask the state associations to establish parallel state TEPS commissions and then local commissions. And now we have 56 state commissions, and nobody knows how many hundreds and hundreds of local TEPS commissions. All of these are constantly challenging ideas to the National TEPS Commission as a winnowing process for the establishment of policy of the teaching profession in this country. At no time has the National TEPS Commission presumed that it had the power to fix policy for this profession. It has the power to be the voice, the focus of the policy making. And I can name a number of things to you. For example, the policy that there should be a minimum of the bachelor's degree for any teaching position in the United States came up in the classroom teachers of this country and others. And by the way, there was some maneuvering around at Detroit to recommend the Representative Assembly that they modify this requirement becomes effective next September. My advice to the people was, don't do it. You'll get clobbered in the Representative Assembly. Because this policy came up from the 1,600,000 public school teachers in this country, and I don't think they're fixing to retreat on that standard. Or I mentioned the standard for the establishment and support of INCATE. That policy came from the grassroots in this country, up to the TEPS Commission. Or I mentioned the membership requirement. That's what I was commenting on just now. It becomes effective next year. Of course, the classroom teachers carried the ball in that, but the TEPS had a little bit to do with it. We knew what the sentiment of the teachers were with this country, and it became a policy. A second step in developing autonomy is that we assign specialized tasks to expert groups. I'm going to have to start skipping here now. The whole mass of the teaching profession in this country can no more execute its policies than the people of this nation could execute the laws of this nation. We must assign these things to expert groups. To TEPS, for example, the authority to move toward higher standards, INCATE accreditation, and so it goes down the line. And take a teacher education institution, the development policy by the profession, and the assignment of the task of training our members, preparing our members, frees the institution and confers upon it a powerful autonomy that it would never have otherwise. Well, these are characteristics. I could name all these different committees. All have been assigned as specialized tasks because they're expert groups. And third, there must be a system of checks and balances. That is, we live in a democracy. We want every human being treated fairly and every group treated fairly. And it's human nature if any group, given extraordinary powers, is likely to mistreat, sometimes unwittingly, another group. Take the guidelines for professional negotiations, for example. Develop after wide consultation with a great many people, or the one on sanctions, which after the Utah experience may be changed. I don't know. But if it is, it'll be a policy that appears to be the consensus of the profession across this country. You see, in the Utah situation, the NEA had three alternatives. One was to assume that the teachers of Utah were inevitably right and the other side inevitably wrong, and therefore automatically apply sanctions. Number two was to follow the procedure we then had of only invoking sanctions after careful, thorough, objective study and recommendation of that investigating team as to yes or no. The third alternative would be that in cases like Utah and others where the decision is already made by the unit, that the NEA take no action at all. I don't know what the answer will be, but I know that it has to be a policy that meets a consensus of this profession. Now, to say that we are hierarchy at the NEA and going to decide what we will do, this won't get it. I've lived long enough to know that. Of course, this old thing about sanctions reminds me the time that Charlie Wilson, he's dead now, you remember, came in as Mr. Eisenhower's defense secretary. Hadn't been down in Washington a month until he delivered himself of this great statement that what's good for General Motors is good for this country. Well, he went through a turmoil, pummeling from the press and the politicians for 6 weeks on this thing, and finally he was making a speech in Chicago, and somebody asked him about it, and he said, well, I can illustrate my feelings about it better by telling you a story. He said, recently the birds were migrating south, and a flock of them stopped in one of the parks out in Washington for the night, and the next morning the birds at daybreak got up and flew on to South Carolina. They got to South Carolina at dusk, they looked around, and they missed one of the birds, and somebody said, where's Charlie? Nobody knew. An hour or two later, Charlie came limping in with every feather on his body turned the wrong way. He looked like he'd been pushed into a concrete mixer, and they said, what happened to you? Well, he said, you birds must have left earlier. Then I waked up, and he said, you remember it was a pea soupy morning, and when I did wake up and realized you were gone, I took off, but I must have been flying lower than I thought, because I got into the dead-bangedest badminton game you ever saw in your life. Anybody who wants to discuss sanctions can get into that kind of a contest right away. Another instance of check and balance is the INCATE structure, in which you have 6 practitioners from the elementary and secondary schools, you have 10 college people, you have 2 from the legal authorities and 1 from the School Board Association. Now, there are those There's a reason in this. 12 of the 23 major national crediting agencies have joint counsel like this, and the reason is that you have a system of check and balances, where the rights and the duties and responsibilities and the privileges of all segments of the profession are protected. Now, some are saying that the practitioners ought to be elbowed out of this process. I can only speak for Tim Stennett. I just will say very bluntly that I'll have no part of that. We had they want to turn it back to an all-institutional control. We had this for 25 years, and it didn't work. And it won't work for the simple reason that any given parochial group forms themselves into a mutual protective society. Harold, you understand that language, don't you? It becomes a sweetness and light process. Old Joe Dokes out here, the president of the college, after all, he's got an inferior college, but he's a good old boy and he's trying. He's got a lot of problems, so we'll credit him, you see what I mean? That will do more to destroy professional autonomy. What we're driving for in this country than anything I can think of, and it must not be allowed to happen. Well, I must skip on here. Don't forget the checks and balances. By the way, even in the discipline of our own members, there must be checks and balances for the protection of the individual. I have recently started to say I have the privilege, I'll put it this way, I've had the painful ordeal of watching the hearing of the discipline of 3 members of the NEA. I'll go into no detail because, well, Mr. Liebman and others say that the NEA never expels anybody. They just don't know what they're talking about. The NEA just simply doesn't embarrass human beings. It doesn't publicize these. But I sat from 8 o'clock in the morning until midnight and watched this hearing. We had legal counsel there, the law firm in Washington, the legal counsel of the NEA, guiding our president at every step of the way to be certain of what? That these human beings had a fair trial, that the matter went on to the court, that the courts could not find any unfairness in this thing. And I thought to myself as I looked on that they leaned over so far backwards to give these people a fair trial that they made a farce of it. I mean, they took advantage of it. But you must have these checks and balances, protection of human beings. Now, what are the obstacles to professional autonomy? And I'm sure going to have to skip now. First, I think it's teachers themselves. Not all teachers, of course, but too many. Call it timidity or inertia or indifference. It adds up to an unwillingness of too many of our profession to pay the price of achieving the management of our specialized service to society. The hardest single concept for teachers to accept, or at least to accept and activate, is that any professional person has an indispensable and an indivisible dual role. First, he's a practitioner, a performer in the classroom, but he has an equally important role, and that is a member of a sensitive member and a responsible member of a profession. We will all gladly exercise the first and get great joy out of it. But we find the second very difficult to do. We're like the citizen who supports his family well, he works hard, he pays his bills, but he won't vote, and he will have nothing to do with political and governmental processes. I see Christine Mitchell sitting back here. Bless her heart, she went through one of the Utah things. We were asked to declare sanctions against the overseas schools, and in all honor and candor, they should have been declared, but the request came right in the midst of the Cuban crisis, and of course we couldn't do it. But we did send out an urgent advisory to our membership, 40 or 50,000 letters to associations, local associations, and so on. We didn't say don't take jobs, but we said you ought to know the conditions and how these teachers have been mistreated. What happened? The Defense Department boasts that we publicized and glamorized these positions, and they had more applicants than they ever had before. No, I don't know whether this is true or not. Our letter came at the tail end of their recruiting process. But I say if it is true, then we've got to do an awful lot of thinking in this country about our responsibility to our professional colleagues. If any teacher outside of Utah barges in there and takes one of the jobs that these teachers are planning to go back to, we'd better do some thinking about our responsibility to our professional colleagues. I don't want to see us to come to the time in this profession of ours that we blacklist and boycott people and expel them and all this kind of thing. These are the things we ought to do because they are right. I wish we'd had the attitude of the fellow that called Dr. Gallup one night at, 3 o'clock in the morning, and Dr. Gallup, in his staggering in his sleep, telephone said hello, and the voice said, "Is this Dr. George Gallup?" And he said, "Yes, what do you want?" And the fellow at the other end of the wire said, "I just rung you up to tell you I've changed my mind." I wish we'd change our mind about this. Well, a second obstacle is that autonomy has two faces. One is the face of privilege and right. Now, you can't have the other is the face of obligation. You can't have one without the other. The teacher who joyfully and eagerly enters into the performance of his classroom duties but pulled back from the other is somehow, as I said, analogous to the citizen who won't assume any responsibility for. Perhaps this whole business is too hard for us. You know my story about the Arkansas hound dog named Jasper, don't you? Well, you ought to be cultivated. You ought to learn these things. Little town where I grew up down in Arkansas, as I was growing up as a farmer, that developed quite an affluent business with the trading in coon furs with the furriers in St. Louis. And his secret was he had a hound dog named Jasper that could go out into the woods and come back with a coon just exactly the size that the furrier in St. Louis had ordered. If they needed a 12 by 14 coon skin to fit out a coat, complete a coat, well, they'd wire this farmer, and he'd cut the board on which he was going to dry this coon skin just the size of the skin he wanted. And he'd put it out back of the barn, and Jasper would study this and go off in the woods, and in due time he'd come back with this size coon. It's the truth. Well, this went along beautifully until one day the old lady inadvertently left the ironing board out back of the barn. And Jasper took a look and then a double take on that thing and went off yelping and howling in the woods. Nobody's ever heard of him since. Now, maybe this is too hard a task, too big a task for us. I don't think it is. Well, the third obstacle is considering teachers as civil servants and not professionals. This is the whole heart of the upswing for professional negotiations. That we aren't civil servants. We aren't just another kind of employer where supervisor, you get salaries as low as you can, enough to get an equal to get a staff with, and then you depend upon supervisor's service to produce results. That isn't professional service at all. We are professional people with the power, the ability to participate in a creative task of improving education for every child in the community, and we insist upon this right. An incident happened recently of Chicago Tribune called the Kennedy administration is leading us down to the road to socialism because the representative of the Civil Service Commission appeared there last June recruiting college graduates and announced to the world that he was looking for 16,300 engineers and thousands of other professional people, and the federal government was prepared to compete with private industry in wages and in fringe benefits. And the Tribune called this socialism. No, the Tribune simply is focused upon a generation ago when public employees were considered as holding gratuitous sinecures. They were parasites on the body politic. That's no longer true. Life has proliferated and become complex at every instrumentality of government now hiring thousands of professional people. And they're treating them as professional people. The President's executive order of January the 1st, 1962, giving federal employees now the right to negotiate with their unit. Of course, they don't have the right to strike, but they're treating them now as professional people with certain rights and powers and responsibilities, not as civil servants to be ordered. My favorite story, I insert at this point, and I tell it to ask the question, who speaks for us? We're going to speak for ourselves. The story of the grand old warrior from Missouri, many of you have heard me tell it many times. In the 1960 presidential campaign, you remember that he got rather profane, or at least his language was purple, let's put it that way. In one of his telecasts, he was consigning a certain political party, I don't remember which one it was, to the nether regions in rather blunt language. And Mr. Nixon followed him the next day with a 30-minute telecast in which he devoted to the terrible thing of how Mr. Truman was corrupting the morals and the language of the young people of this country. About a week or 2 weeks later, Mr. Truman was in New York visiting Margaret and his new grandson, who at that time I think was about a year old, and he said to Margaret, "Now, Margaret, when my grandson gets old enough, I'm going to teach him to talk." And Margaret said, "The hell you are." Who speak for us? We're going to speak for ourselves. One other obstacle to professional autonomy is the divisions in education. I mentioned the dichotomies between the people in higher education and the lower a minute ago. This is only a fragment of the divisions in education. Every subspecialty wants to call itself a profession. Walter knows, and if he tells my dear friend Alan Roosevelt about this, I'll deny it. Well, I don't know. I've said it to Alan many times. New Jersey issues 6 to 8 certificates at the last count. They've got a computer working on it now. They may come up with some more. Why? Because every specialty in education demands the status of a special certificate. And I say this is all wrong. We ought to have one legal license. Whatever your teaching field is, we're one profession. Engineering has, 8 or 10 different specialties, but they have one profession of engineering. Well, now let me get down to the specifics and the mechanics of autonomy for the teaching profession. Professional development requires that the profession must, 1, define minimums of preparation for admission to practice. Number 2, delineate the nature of the content of this preparation. Number 3, identify the institutions which are equipped to offer quality programs through careful selection and scholarly curricular programs. And we have to do that through an accrediting process. The critics of NCATE now are saying that the profession ought to have its impact through certification requirements. I say this is the worst possible way. For the simple reason, then you get down to the job of specifying this little 2-hour course and that little 3-hour course and this little 2-hour course until this institution would have to take scissors and a paste pot and make its teacher education curriculum by clipping the certification requirements. This is no way to run a railroad or a profession. 4, maintain a national professional accrediting process in order to guarantee a quality floor of preparation for the numerous and diverse institutions engaged in teacher education. There are 1,150 of these institutions, including, I think, 74 junior colleges, and there are 38 institutions so amorphous in character we just classify them in our certification manual as miscellaneous. Is that what we call them? Well, something. Anyhow, in that are theological seminaries, dancing schools, art academies, and what have you. 5, define certification standards, prescriptions and processes which will give legal undergirding to the teacher education program. That's what certification ought to do. It ought to give legal undergirding to the teacher education program, not dictate that program. 6, secure the legal right. Get this, secure the legal right through Professional Practices Acts to designate professional boards to determine the standards of certification and see to their enforcement. The TEPS Commission is working on that now. Indiana State Teachers Association has had such a board in the state of Indiana for many years called the Indiana Teacher Training and Licensing Commission, made up of professional people who determine the certification requirements, the certificates, and who in large part determine the teacher education program. There are 11 such legal entities in this country, and in the last 2 years, Kentucky and Florida have passed Professional Practices Act, saying that teaching is a profession, and certain obligations will be put into the hands of the profession. Oregon has a Modified Practice Act. New York and Michigan now have developed Professional Practice Act, and this will have to become universal, in my judgment. 7, define programs of professional growth in service. 8, maintain pre-professional organizations for young people, like FTA and the SNEA. 10, maintain strong state TEPS commissions as an essential part. You see, I'm talking about the professional development aspect now, getting the competent person on the job, as an essential part of the policy-making process regarding standards of admission. 11, maintain local TEPS commissions for participation purposes. Now, the professional welfare area requires that the profession must first define the teaching climate conducive to high-quality professional service. This includes conditions of work, personnel policies, academic freedom, and academic authority. And I pay tribute to the Department of Classroom Teachers in its development of the Conditions of Work project. I put that new book of mine out over there. I'm not selling the books, but I wanted you to see that I thought so much of the department's work in that field and others that I wrote 2 chapters in that book based on it. I think this is a landmark, and they're now set up on a new one called Time to Teach. Second, must maintain machinery at the national and state level. This would be the PR&R Commission, to investigate and take action on cases involving unfair treatment of teachers, including dismissal. Now, you can talk in all the beautiful language you want to about fair treatment for teachers, but until you establish a machinery as a recourse to the mistreated teacher and see that that machinery operates, you don't have a profession. Third, maintain distress funds, such as the Duchesne Defense Fund, for assistance to mistreated teachers, both for subsistence and legal aid. You would be appalled to see the letters that come across Miss Kinnaird's desk there, and I eventually get to see them. She's chairman of the administrative committee. You would be appalled at the petty ways in which teachers are mistreated, and the only recourse they have is the recourse of their professional colleagues, and our professional colleagues must maintain the machinery and this kind of a fund. Of course, I'm delighted we're setting out upon now the raising of a mass distress fund, which I've advocated long. By the way, I talked to Dr. Clark Link about this, and I was back to Washington, and he's for it 100%, and he says he has no preconceived notions. He hopes this group will gather and brainstorm and come up with ideas about what size this fund ought to be and how we raise it. I often think of the Overseas Education Association, and tomorrow, a national emergency, or come September, 6,500 of them could be out of a job for the rest of the year and no pay. We've got to do something about this. 5, maintain grievance machinery at the local level. And I think John Marvin and the PR&R Commission are going to work on that this year. Maintain grievance machinery at the local level, which would also handle ethics cases. 6, secure professional negotiation agreement and establish appropriate machinery for developing agreements regarding policies under which local staff works, including study committees, salary committees, and so forth. And 7th, maintain clear procedures for enforcing sanctions in cases of whatever kind of intolerable conditions. Well, my time is up. I still have about 40 pages left here. But I don't fear your wrath nearly as much as I do that of my wife, so I'm going to come to the conclusion of this. I have a whole section on sanctions, but your time is limited, and I apologize for taking as long time as I have. Let me come to the conclusion here. I want to say one thing about sanctions. At Detroit, reporters by the dozens asked me, what's the difference in sanctions and strike? And of course, there are many differences. Sanctions, that is withdrawing of service, and that's just one of 8 or 10 kinds of sanctions. Does not violate a contract, does not interrupt service to children. It gives the offending district or state 3 to 6 months notice that there are inferior conditions here, and we're not going to let our people come here because they can't perform the services they're trained to perform, and if you want second and third rate services, you can have them. Now, the strike says you can't have them. We'll picket the place, and we'll see that there's work stoppage. But the interesting thing to me is they asked me then, what's the difference between Utah and the New York City situation, in which you remember the teachers in New York are threatened now not to start back school? Well, I think the difference is just this. The teachers in New York City have shifted to sanctions now. The contract that they negotiated, UFT, about which they bragged so loudly, included a no-strike clause. And now they can't strike. And so they're going to get around this by withdrawing services before school opens. And they've come back to the sanction. Now, the difference will be, however, that they'll picket the buildings and shut off service, where I take it this will not happen in Utah. Well, the other thing I want to say about sanctions, the National School Boards Association seems to tend toward an adamant posture regarding both negotiations and sanctions. The plea is that they cannot surrender their legal authority. I have no hesitancy whatever in saying that this hiding behind the law is an ostrich-like resort, hiding their heads in the sand while the world all about is changing and a new climate of human rights is inexorably emerging for teachers. Theirs is, of course, a very human reaction, but it will not meet the new conditions now already upon us. And I contend it is not interfering with their legal authority one whatsoever, but it actually is enhancing and enlarging their power by endowing teachers with what I call the creative power of participation and make their decisions infinitely more. When I think of this attitude of theirs, I think of the good old lady, sweet old lady on the school board that they brought up, questioned time and again, and finally to the point of discharging a janitor who was quite an unkempt, dirty individual, and the board couldn't take it any longer, and she finally said, well, he's such a sweet, nice, clean person inside. She said, do we have to fire him? And the school board president said, well, we either got to fire him or turn him inside out. Well, yeah. In conclusion, the drive for autonomy for the teaching profession, in its deepest meanings, is a drive geared to the premise of significance. It is a drive to achieve the sense of recognition of the individual teacher as a competent and sensitive professional person. It is a drive geared to the heroic premise, the premise of identity, validity, and dignity of human life. It is a drive to negate the all too evident trend toward mass organization and mass manipulation, the handle of people as if they were dumb, driven cattle. It is, if you wish, a drive for ego motivation, as contrasted with the concept of reducing the status of teaching as job analysis, mechanized, automated robot operation. The teacher, as a thinking, feeling, sensitive, altruistic human entity, must prevail, because all of life and all of society, in their unfolding toward the upper habitations of the human spirit, are dependent upon the life-giving touch of such a teacher.